1954, San Francisco, California. The 1950s and 60s saw the United States in particular grasping at straws for any type of advancements in spycraft. The pursuit for information in beating the Soviet Union was at an all-time high. Convinced that the USSR was developing some type of mind control weapon, the United States sought out extreme measures to try and beat them to the punch. Perhaps the most notable of these classified experiments would come to be known by MKUltra, a mind control experiment conducted on unsuspecting American citizens through how they reacted to different types of psychoactive drugs, torture, and hypnosis. However, what many people possibly don't know is the myriad of other projects going on at the same time as MKUltra. Operation Midnight Climax, as it was officially called, was a top-secret program to see if under the influence of drugs and sex, information could be extracted from high-value individuals. However, much like MKUltra, these tests were conducted on U.S. citizens without their knowledge. MKUltra stands as perhaps one of the largest classified experiments ever, and is a pristine example of the lengths that a government will go to try to be one step ahead of their enemies. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a secretive government program, perhaps one that we still know very little about the true inner workings of, to see if this truly was some type of sick experiment conducted on the American public for the interests of national security, and even perhaps some rather strange voyeuristic behavior by government agents that tried to be hidden from the general public. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore MKUltra in Operation Midnight Climax. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you were listening to this show on YouTube, first I want to tell you to like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. If you're checking out the show on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode, and I greatly appreciate it. Feel free to follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown. You can keep up to date with everything in regards to this show there. But with that being said, originally, for this week's episode, I was going to cover just Operation Midnight Climax, as I thought that was a good topic for an episode, and to be worthy to be covered as its own topic, and it still relatively could be covered as its own topic. However, as I got about halfway through writing the script for this episode, I realized that while Operation Midnight Climax had enough substance, I found myself talking all this game about an MKUltra episode, and doing that episode, and saving that for another day, and all of this stuff. And then I realized that this is as close as I have gotten to doing the MKUltra episode period, and in a while. As I've talked about it, floated around the idea, it's been in my episode queue list for a very long time. Like I said, this is the closest I had ever gotten to it. So I realized because of that, and since I had not yet done any deep dive research on it, I backtracked and rewrote portions of this week's script and went back for more research to make this not only the episode on Operation Midnight Climax, but also the official episode on possibly one of the most egregious examples of government experimentation done on a large scale ever in MKUltra. You are welcome. Now, while I thought about saving that episode, like I said, I kind of procrastinated a little bit, but instead, I've opted to research it more and do a full episode, combine the topics together, and maybe have this be a little bit longer than average, rather than have you wait multiple weeks before I try to even attempt to cover MKUltra again. The plot points between the two largely consist to be the same, and thus it made sense for me to obviously combine the episodes together and do them as one large lump sum of an episode, as opposed to give you, for lack of a better words, Chinese water torture and wait for an MKUltra episode much later on. But with that all being said, and me basically confessing to doing even more work for this week, how today's episode is going to work is that we need to talk about an event and some history, first leading up to MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax, because I personally think that plays a role into why I personally believe the government was able to use the excuses that they did to conduct these types of experiments. And then we're going to talk about the mastermind behind this entire project, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, and then branch out and talk about the projects and the experiments themselves, and then wrap them up with my own theories and personal opinions. Now, like I said, before we dive into the project and the topic we have today, we have to do a little history lesson. And before you say anything about not wanting to sit down and learn history, I get it. But I try my best to make it fun and knowledgeable, and I hope I do, however. This history session does pertain to the topic, and it does pertain as to why maybe the CIA basically used this as an excuse to drive fear into millions of Americans, that we were at severe risk from a much larger enemy in the world at the time, aka Russia, aka communism, which I have found myself talking about a lot recently, and I swear it is not on purpose at all. I kind of find myself doing these episodes these past few weeks, and everything just kind of goes back to communism, and I swear, I am not doing it on purpose, and you have to believe me. It is like I start doing research, and I'm like, oh great, it's communism again, but it pertains to the episode, so just stick with me here. But to put all of this into perspective, we need to talk about the Red Scare. Now, the Red Scare was a time in history during the early 1950s when a senator named Joe McCarthy would make repeated claims and launch very publicized probes into different members of the government over suspected ties to communism. Because of these and his frequent comments that communists could be anywhere and everywhere, and that Russian spies were practically in the streets and in your home, and this caused what could only be described as kind of a modern-day Salem witch trials, just with less hanging and less witches. Now, because of McCarthy coming out and saying all of these things and making these claims, it almost created a fear within the American political scene, and many other politicians didn't dare call out McCarthy on his antics for the sake of being called a disloyal to the country during a time when tensions with communist Russia were running high. McCarthy would make these claims that members of the government were communist and working for Russia, and of course this pot stirring made things worse and amplified the divide within the political landscape at the time. Because of all these things happening on the main stage within the US government, it captured the attention of the general public at the time, and while McCarthy's claims mostly came with not a whole lot of evidence to back them up, it was enough to cost some people their jobs within the government and cost some very heavy criticism to others. Now, this Red Scare situation with McCarthy would kind of spill over into the general public, as of course during the Cold War and the 1950s, anti-communist propaganda was at an all-time high, and many feared the idea of communism, and communism being the antithesis of everything America stood for at the time. And kind of still does, in sort of a way. However, what in that a way was established a precedent of things being done for the sake of national interest, and to try to beat the Soviets. Now, it is important to note this idea that things could be done for the sake of national security is not a new thing by any means, and even though experimentation done on the general public by the CIA was actually banned by President Truman in 1947, as we will come to find out, if the CIA could explain that these experiments would benefit national security, whether they truly were or not, they would be let off with a free pass. And of course, this would be the case with Operation Midnight Climax and MKUltra. In my opinion, this idea of national security of the time was spurred on by the Red Scare and the events that were unfolding and would unfold throughout the world during the Cold War. No one wanted spies or foreign agents on American soil, so of course you could use that as your excuse to do some pretty messed up stuff. At the center of this entire project and controversy with MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax would be a man named Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Now, whenever I decided to do a broad overview of MKUltra, and once I started looking through this, I originally wanted to do basically a general synopsis. And then when I decided to do the entirety of MKUltra, I wanted to give you as comprehensive as of a background of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb that I could possibly find. Sidney Gottlieb would be born on August 3rd, 1918, in the Bronx, to Hungarian Jewish immigrants. Now, Gottlieb would go on to become super educated, and his older brother David was a plant biologist, and it seemed like early on Sidney wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. In 1936, he would attend City College in New York City, but wanted to pursue biology, and City College did not offer that, so he would end up transferring to the University of Wisconsin. He would attend classes at Arkansas Tech University that would put him on the path to the University of Wisconsin, and would graduate at near the top of his class in 1940. His exemplary abilities of his student would, or his kind of ability of being a student, would earn him recognition from the assistant dean of the College of Agriculture at UW, and that would get him into the California Institute of Technology, where Sidney would obtain his doctorate in biochemistry in 1943. Sidney would meet his wife while at CIT, and during this time, World War II was a present, ongoing conflict, and due to a birth defect leaving Sidney with a club foot, he was unable to serve in the military, even though he really wanted to. Since he was denied service, yet he still wanted to serve the country the best way he could, he would move to Virginia to be closer to Washington, D.C. Now, once he moved there with his family, it would then be in 1948 where he would obtain a job working for the U.S. government. Initially, Sidney started working for a variety of different government organizations, like the Department of Agriculture, the FDA, and the National Research Council. Now, while at the National Research Council, Sidney would describe being, and I quote, exposed to some interesting work concerning ergot alkaloids as vasoconstrictors and hallucinogens. Now, it would be those things that Sidney would become exposed to at that age that very well could have planted the seeds for what he was about to do, and what his role would eventually become within the CIA. In 1951, Sidney would be recruited by the CIA and would begin working there, and hired by then Deputy Director of Operations, Allen Dulles, who had received a recommendation from his old associate, Dean of Agriculture from UW. Sidney did not fit the traditional mold of someone that the CIA might have recruited during this time period. Very often the CIA recruited strictly from Ivy League schools up and down the East Coast, and Sidney did not fit that traditional mold. Now, the connection between the Associate Dean of Ag at UW and the CIA went much deeper. This man, Ira Baldwin, used to oversee the biowarfare program at Fort Detrick in Maryland. And since Ira Baldwin was a significant mentor to Sidney Gottlieb, Sidney would become familiar with poisons and biowarfare by spending time with Baldwin. Now, from this point on, Sidney would become well versed with the issues facing the United States during this time. The threat of the USSR and spies infiltrating the United States was a constant fear, which was perpetrated by the Red Scare. Citizens and the government had feared that the USSR could strike America through espionage, and the CIA was convinced that the USSR and China were developing weapons that could brainwash and control the minds of subjects, that thought of which was very concerning to the CIA and the American government. Gottlieb would then become associated with Project Bluebird, and later renamed to Project Artichoke, which was the CIA's first rendition of what would later become MKUltra. The basis of both Bluebird and Artichoke was the testing of drugs during interrogation settings to try and get clandestine information out of someone. Dulles and Gottlieb wanted something closer to a truth serum more than anything else, a substance that could get the information they wanted from a captive. However many drugs they tried did not really work the way they would have liked them to. It was Gottlieb who would suggest the uses of a drug named lysergic acid dithylamide, or better known as LSD. Gottlieb discovered that LSD had never truly been used in these tests before under these conditions, and after dosing himself with the drug, Gottlieb accelerated the studies of the drug and the testing of it on agents at the CIA who agreed to testing. Gottlieb would continue these tests, and while Allen Dulles would be promoted to the director of the CIA, Gottlieb would know, having these prior connections and relations with Dulles, that any testing that he wanted to conduct would be approved. In August of 1953 is when Project MKUltra would be approved, and thus started the whole spiral of testings of quote-unquote brain warfare, as it would often be referred to. MKUltra was the testing of LSD and other related experiments on unknowing and non-consenting test subjects. Overall, it was a severe human rights violation that was going on. While MKUltra existed, numerous other projects, like Operation Midnight Climax, was also going on during this time. And these agents and researchers that Gottlieb had assigned to these projects would conduct them and report their findings back to him. Perhaps one of the more significant moments of the project was when, during the MKUltra trials, an Army researcher and member of the Biological Warfare Division at Fort Detrick in Maryland, named Frank Olson, would be dosed with LSD by Gottlieb without his permission. What would ensue would be a 9-day mental health spiral that would end with Frank Olson falling multiple stories to his death at the Hotel Statler in New York City. This death, wrapped in controversy, is still hotly debated, and one I will dive into here more in a little bit. In addition to this, you have a larger connection with MKUltra to possibly one of the most dangerous domestic terrorists of our time in Theodore Kaczynski, better known by the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski, while a student at Harvard, was subjected to a battery of tests over multiple years by Henry Murray, a CIA agent who was carrying out MKUltra testing. Now, it is not confirmed or denied, but heavily speculated that this constant abuse and experimentation that Kaczynski suffered thoroughly shaped his worldview entirely, and thus possibly helped contribute to the radicalization of him into the Unabomber. The experiments conducted by MKUltra were not just limited to that of LSD exposure. You had subjects undergoing polygraph tests while being under hypnotic treatments, exposure to a variety of different chemicals, and other tests for treatments that can be done to get the best results of information out of a suspect during interrogation. In declassified documents, materials that were discussed as possibly being tests that would be treatments that would leave subjects with permanent disability, and even others that could induce the symptoms of a lingering illness that can be extended for long periods in the case the subject was non-cooperative. You also had documents detailing shock therapy being used in several instances, as well as experimentation with quote-unquote knockout pills and substances that could alter the personality structure of an individual. Test subjects for the MKUltra experiments were varied. Some had volunteered, but many others did not volunteer and were forced to endure these experiments. From mentally challenged people, prisoners, and even American soldiers like Frank Olson were dosed and experimented on at some point or another. Prisoners were often used, and even notorious mobster Whitey Bulger was an MKUltra test subject. The tests on Bulger would take place in 1957 at the Atlanta Penitentiary. Bulger would describe the experiments with the following, and I quote, 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. He would continue, total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares, and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. Now, in the case of Frank Olson, perhaps the most documented case of the side effects of MKUltra testing, who was dosed by Dr. Gottlieb without his consent, which would ultimately lead him on a mental health spiral, which ended up with him passing away. Olson was originally working in the Biowarfare Division at Fort Detrick under Ira Baldwin when he originally first worked there. Remember, Ira Baldwin again was the mentor of Dr. Sidney Gottlieb while Gottlieb was attending UW. While working for the Biowarfare Division, Olson had seen some shit, for lack of a better word. Back in 1943, Olson had worked with ex-Nazis through Operation Paperclip, the top-secret operation at the time, to bring over captured and defected Nazi scientists to use them in the future development of the United States weapon program. And Olson worked with these ex-Nazi scientists on a potential utilization of aerosolized anthrax. Now, if you happen to not know what anthrax is, go look it up. But if you do know what anthrax is, you know it's bad news. And it's pretty much you touch it, you breathe it, you die. Olson was also involved in other operations that tested toxic chemicals on animals as well, in Operation Sea Spray, which was another operation that released a potential infection-causing bacteria into the coastal mist off the coast of San Francisco that reached all throughout the city to see what happened and determine how vulnerable a coastal city might be to a possible bioweapon attack while the citizens of San Francisco were completely oblivious and, of course, did not agree to this testing in any way, shape, or form. In 1952, Olson would be appointed to the committee for Operation Artichoke, the MKUltra precursor, and even though he would step down from the biowarfare division, he would start working for the CIA, pretty much doing the exact same thing, and all the things he was involved with took a toll on his mental health. Testing chemical weapons on animals and seeing piles of dead monkeys in the laboratories and being in the room where test subjects would be subjected to round after round after round of experimental torture, essentially to the point of death. Now, in Olson's drugging and eventual passing away, Olson would be one of many that were close to MKUltra that would be drugged without their knowledge, with a quote-unquote truth serum, while Gottlieb, his right-hand man, Dr. Robert Lashbrook, and many others were at a cabin retreat in Maryland. Now, after being dosed, Frank Olson would head home and was instantly affected. He confided to his wife that he had made a terrible mistake, and that in the days that followed, Olson became disoriented, aggressive, and physically confused and emotionally confused about the work he was doing with Project MKUltra. On November 24th, Olson would return home from work early with a co-worker, John Stubbs, who was there because the agency was concerned through Olson's behavior that he might hurt his wife, and that Olson was going to see a doctor for a psychiatric evaluation. Olson would travel to New York City with his boss, Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Rouette, and Gottlieb's right-hand man, Dr. Lashbrook, for Olson to undergo the testing. They would meet with Harold Abramson, who Olson had known through prior CIA connections and through Olson's work. On November 28th, while at the Hotel Statler in New York City, at 2 a.m. in the morning, Olson would jump numerous stories from the hotel and hit the ground below. The night manager on duty would rush to Olson, who was still barely alive at the time, and Olson would attempt to say something. However, he would not be able to get it out and pass away there on the street. When police responded, they would find Dr. Lashbrook, in which Olson was sharing his room with, sitting on the toilet. In the ensuing investigation, the room 1018A, in which Olson and Lashbrook were staying in, connected a call from the room to a number associated with Dr. Abramson. The voices on the line said, "Well, he's gone." And the reply, "Well, that's too bad." Originally declared a suicide, quickly turned into a wrongful death lawsuit from Frank Olson's family once it was disclosed that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge. In the years that followed, debate raged over the true case and cause of Olson's death, and even the night manager, the first one to find Olson after the jump, doubted the jump entirely. They would state, and I quote, "In all my years in the hotel business, I never encountered a case where someone got up in the middle of the night, ran across a dark room in his underwear, avoiding two beds, and dove through a closed window with the shade and curtains drawn." Now, as it turns out, during the Korean War, and this is a little background for you to kind of add to this conspiracy, so kind of pay attention to what I'm about to say here. During the Korean War, American POWs were making claims during interrogations that the United States was using bioweapons against North Korea. The United States, however, would rush to many of these POWs, and again, they're POWs, so they're Americans, and would state to these POWs that they must recant their statements and threaten to charge these American POWs with treason for cooperating with their abductors. At the time, Frank Olson was in Europe and had seen some of these interrogations himself, and thought the United States was using bioweapons and germ warfare against the Koreans. Now, this statement and belief would have been a big no-no. Because of Frank Olson now becoming outspoken about the United States' usage of supposed bioweapons, according to some, this would have made him a target, and his family agrees. His son, Eric Olson, fought for answers even after the wrongful death suit and settlement, and was routinely stonewalled by the U.S. government, who did not want to open this case or pursue it any further. He would appeal later in 1996, however, he would not get very far. Eric Olson would state that the method of his father's death would be consistent with that of assassination techniques used by the CIA, and referenced that it was actually on the first page of the CIA's first manual on assassinations with, and I quote the following, "The most efficient accident in simple assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more, onto a hard surface. In 2017, Netflix would produce a documentary series based on the death of Frank Olson, and perhaps the most compelling claim made would be from journalist Seymour Hersh, who would state that the U.S. government had processes to identify possible security threats and those who might disclose secrets to either foreign entities or to the general public, and that those individuals were considered a risk. He would state that Frank Olson was murdered by the CIA because of his belief and possibility that he could disclose the bioweapons program of the United States, and after his death, a subsequent cover-up ensued. Hersh would not elaborate on this claim, as he stated that if he did, it would disclose the informant that gave him the information. Now, while Frank Olson and Ted Kaczynski and Whitey Bulger were some of the more known test subjects of MKUltra, another possible subject I want to bring into the fold here is a person that I did not know about until I listened to another podcast that I frequent, and that being Theories of the Third Kind. Big shout out to them. If you do not know anything about me, or me personally, Theories of the Third Kind, I could arguably quote, gave me the information to start this show. So again, even more of a big shout out to them. I love those guys. They are fantastic. I thoroughly recommend checking them out. Now, this individual, as another possible MKUltra test subject, was a man by the name of Lewis Hastings. Now, if you have no idea who Lewis Hastings is, let me tell you. Lewis Hastings was a man who went on a killing spree in 1983 and killed 6 residents of a 22-resident large town in rural Alaska named McCarthy. Hastings was reportedly a product of mental illness while being raised, and himself suffered from mental health issues and suffered a severe distaste for technological advancement, and despised the Alaska pipeline project underway in Alaska during the time. He despised the Alaska Pipeline Project so much, he had planned an attack of stealing a gasoline truck and driving it into a pumping station along the pipeline, killing himself in the process. And to get away with it, Lewis Hastings planned on killing the entire small town of McCarthy so no one knew it was him. Hastings, by all accounts, was an environmentalist who fled from California in the lower 48 because he viewed Alaska as the last great frontier untouched by society's tech advancements. Now, on Theories of the Third Kind, they speculated that Lewis Hastings could have been a test subject of MKUltra, and that his opinions and his anti-technology stance sounds very similar to that of Ted Kaczynski and other counterculture movement that occurred shortly after and during the MKUltra testing that was occurring and kind of wrapping up here in the 60s. Now, I could not find where Hastings went to school, but considering college students were a large target of MKUltra, and like in the case of Ted Kaczynski, and the fact that Hastings already had some present mental health issues, he realistically would have been a prime suspect for some type of MKUltra testing. Whether or not that is the case, we might not truly ever know. Now, while the effects of MKUltra were widespread, we might not even fully know the full extent of how far it even went. But perhaps what we even know even less about was the offshoot program of MKUltra known as Operation Midnight Climax, which was approved by the CIA to see if LSD with the combination of sex could elicit more information out of a potential spy. George Hunter White, a federal narcotics officer and CIA consultant, would be the main character, I guess, who was tasked with running this operation. The main foundation of the experiment was to hire prostitutes, yes, prostitutes, to bait unsuspecting members of the public to follow them back to a bugged and fake apartment, where then the prostitute would drug the individual, without their knowledge, of course, and then agents would be watching behind one-way glass, placed throughout the room to kind of see what happened. There was a safe house of Operation Midnight Climax operating on Chestnut Street in San Francisco, one in New York City, and one in Mill Valley, California. These prostitutes, once drugging the individual, would often then ask very personal and probing questions during their kind of encounter, and often post-intercourse, to try and get the individuals to disclose personal or otherwise kind of secret information, and kind of just trying to get people to reveal their personal lives. The goal was to try and get these subjects to reveal this information unwillingly, or at least disclose this information that they would not have disclosed otherwise, such as even criminal activity the subjects might have participated in. However, the usage of sex and drugs in this type of setting often led to some unintended but not frowned upon results, as many CIA agents involved with the experiment would participate with the consumption of the drugs and had a good time with the prostitutes for recreational purposes, if you catch my drift. Dr. Lashbrook, who we've talked about already in this episode, was the main figurehead supplying Operation Midnight Climax with the drugs needed to conduct these experiments. Now, additionally, when sex is involved, often you see the side effect of human nature. And by that, I mean people being dirty little perverts. Perhaps none more than George Hunter White, the agent tasked with running the operation. The CIA agents quickly became fascinated with the, and I quote, kinky sex games that played out between the Johns and the hookers. Now, because you had the CIA agents watching these encounters to see if they could get information out of these subjects, the agents splurged on the opportunity to watch the sex and often drank copious amounts of martinis and took plenty of notes. You little perverts. George Hunter White notably said in conjunction to the experiments, and I quote, "I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun." And he would continue and say, "Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest?" Now, I cannot begin to tell you how much that makes my blood boil, but regardless, White and the agents were all pervs and liked watching the sex. However, Operation Midnight Climax and MKUltra as a whole is uncertain what we ended up learning from these experiments to begin with, and if anything from these experiments was truly weaponized like the CIA wanted it to be. Ultimately, the testings would stop, and information about the projects would be leaked, and it would be investigated by CIA member John Vance, who actually had no knowledge into the experiments and would pass along this information he found regarding the experiments on non-consenting individuals. Ultimately, while, again, certain CIA members within the projects, they wanted these experiments to continue. And of course, when John Vance found this information out, he would choose to pass this information along up the pipeline to the Inspector General, and the Inspector General would tell the agents who wanted to continue the experiments to take their research elsewhere, and the agency going forward would follow new ethical guidelines that would be set forth. However, in 1974, a story would be leaked to the New York Times about the government unknowingly testing drugs and conducting experiments on human test subjects. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission was established that was tasked with investigating the CIA for potential illegal activities. The findings of the Rockefeller Commission were damning. The committee found that the CIA was indeed guilty of large-scale spying on Americans, illegal drug testing, wiretaps, and targeting Americans who openly disagreed with the government. In 1976, President Gerald Ford would sign an executive order barring the usage of drug testing on individuals who had not consented to the testing, making it illegal to dose people without their knowledge for testing and research purposes. Later on, in 1977, there would be a series of congressional hearings into the effects of MKUltra on the victims, who had to endure the psychological testing and manipulations. However, many of the agents who were called to testify in these hearings and face any kind of justice for their actions would disappear for days on end, be incredibly difficult, and stonewall the representatives, asking them questions about the experiments. Agents would simply refuse to testify, and much of the paper documentation at the time for MKUltra was destroyed so that it could not be found, which ultimately led to a lack of convictions or justice for the families of those who were experimented on. Now, MKUltra stands as one of the darker moments of human nature, where humans felt the ultimate need for control, so much so to the point they convinced themselves it was to beat the bad guy, and that it was for national security, when in reality, you quite possibly had the largest example of unauthorized spying on the general public and widespread experimentation on the general public. It is only now that sometimes we receive slow drips of unclassified information detailing the extent in which the project really dived into. In late 2024, over 1,200 pages of documents were released to the general public regarding MKUltra, and the extent to which the projects differed and how many of them they were, all with mostly the same focus of how to control human behavior and weaponize it for the greater good of national interest. Now, normally at this point, this is where I would dive into theories of this episode. However, what I'm going to do is a little bit differently. I am going to talk about a tiny little piece of each theory and why I believe all of them play into the overall theory of MKUltra, because I believe every shred of them, or I guess each one, has a little shred of it that's true. Now, this first piece of a theory, I guess, because everything is kind of my own personal theory here, is that this national interest excuse, and that the CIA did these experiments for national interest and used the guise of the Red Scare and the rise of communism and the Cold War as the basis to do so, and looked at dissenting opinions of Americans as hostile, and any effort to undermine the interest of America was highly frowned upon. The experiment was done for the event of Soviet spies entering America and in the event of a possible more serious global conflict. They needed a way to extract information from Soviet spies to get an upper leg in the conflict. Now, like I said, I believe each little pieces of these theory is true. So I do believe this is true, that the CIA genuinely believed this. But I also thoroughly believed that the CIA were a bunch of perverts and sickos, and they probably enjoyed getting to torture and participate in the drugs and the sex with absolutely zero oversight or care in the world. Like I said, I believe this is also a fact. Now, I also believe they did this for the love of the game, and while that might be slightly insensitive, I also believe that there were agents who genuinely enjoyed this type of work, and that conducting these experiments was genuinely fun for them. And while they were using the excuse of using the country's interest at heart, I think they genuinely enjoyed the pleasure that came with using their power against people who were in more vulnerable positions, like prisoners and the mentally disabled. I also believe the CIA had much deeper aspirations here. I believe the CIA used the excuse of the omnipresent threat of the USSR and the rise of communism globally at the time, with the increased spying being done, of course, by the CIA. And then you also had the case of Frank Olson, which I believe was killed by speaking out against the CIA and what the CIA was doing, but also on the kind of US government for possible biowarfare during the Korean War. This, in my opinion, is another underlying theory, that the CIA, if this all worked, and if this worked against Russia, and if it worked against the USSR, of course, if the CIA had a way to control someone's behavior in someone's mind, they could use that on anyone, including the citizens of the United States. And if they could do that, they could control as much as they want. Perhaps the most important tool all humans have is our brain, and how we use our brain to think freely and speak freely. If someone had control over the human mind, that could be stripped, eliminating the idea of dissenting speech forever, and that is truly a scary thing to think about. Like I said, this is kind of my own personal theory, personal opinion, wrapped up in a broad, overarching theory. I think all of these things are true. And like I said, kind of sporadically all throughout this episode, I believe that MKUltra was possibly one of the most egregious examples of experimentation done on the general public ever. Of course, this was all done without the public's knowledge. People were experimented on. They were borderline tortured. And this flew under the radar until it was disclosed in the 1970s. And like I said, we still are getting declassified documents as recently as 2024 when it comes to MKUltra. And I genuinely think that the CIA at the time, yes, they were developing this truth serum where they wanted to figure out something that was the closest thing to truth serum to use it against Russia and Russian spies in the event the Cold War escalated to a much broader thing. But I also think that this is the CIA we're talking about here. If they had the opportunity to control dissenting speech, and if they had the gall to kill Frank Olson, like I personally think they did, they could use this on anybody. They could use the truth serum on anybody. They could pick out anybody off the street, use the truth serum on them, and basically say, hey, your right to basically have a free-thinking opinion is now gone because now you're controlled by the government. That is a truly scary, scary thing to think about, and I hope that's something that everybody thinks about. The power of free speech, the power of thinking independently, doing your own research. These are all things that us as humans should have the ability to do. And it's a truly scary thing to not think about independent thinking and speaking freely and things like that. It's something that I obviously preach all the time. People doing their research, making opinions for themselves, formulating their own opinions and their beliefs and everything like that. I'm a big advocate of that. So the broader thinking of that and thinking of MKUltra as a precursor, a tool of developing some type of truth serum that could be used to control people, not only foreign entities, but maybe even domestic ones. It's a truly scary thing to think about. But again, with that being said, that is going to bring this week's episode into MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax to a close. Again, I kind of procrastinated, I think, the MKUltra episode for a little while, and then once I started diving into Operation Midnight Climax, I realized this was as close as I ever was going to be to covering MKUltra, so I just said screw it, and I decided to cover it overall as a larger episode, or maybe, I guess, a sort of two-topic episode for this week, and I hope you all enjoyed it. But with that being said, that is going to do it for this week's episode on MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.